I think that the lowest and most juvenile and the most boring form of political debate is the tired old game of whataboutism. I know both parties have been guilty of having done it, but during these last few years under Trump's influence, Republicans have reduced it to sounding a lot like the late Pee Wee Herman retorting to every insult, "I know that you are, but what am I?" Then most of us thought that the discovery of the Access Hollywood tape in which Trump bragged about sexual assault, Republicans immediately went back to the 1990s and said, well, what about Monica Lewinsky? And in response to virtually every mention of Trump's close ties to dictators using government contracts to exploit his office for emoluments and giving away state secrets to Russian officials, the refrain always is, what about Hillary's emails? I always wanted to shout out something equally irrelevant, like St. Patrick wasn't even Catholic, he wasn't Irish, or baby oil doesn't really come from babies. But of course, whataboutism isn't actually a political debate at all. It is avoidance of political debate. It's avoidance of meaningful conversation. It is used only to change the subject to get the news cycle to turn to something else that is less embarrassing. It's not new, it's just used more often. Every president that has had any awareness of the importance of television has done it. Many of us are old enough to remember that 40 years ago this month, 220 Marines were killed by a terrorist bomb in Beirut, where we had deployed soldiers to de-escalate an Israeli invasion of Lebanon. This horrible loss of life was so humiliating to President Ronald Reagan that the next day he ordered a wag the dog military invasion of a tiny little island nation called Grenada. There was so little planning for this invasion that helicopters accidentally dropped some soldiers not onto Grenada, but in the sea, where they drowned immediately. And some of the invasion forces actually landed on the wrong island. One commander was preparing to fire artillery on the Venezuelan embassy, thinking that it was a Cuban military fort because he just didn't recognize the flag they were flying. Reagan didn't allow any press coverage of the invasion, probably knowing how badly it was going to go, but he'd invited reporters in when they had straightened everything out and taken control of the island, rescuing 600 American medical students on the island who all had phoned home to tell their parents, we were never in any danger, everything is just fine here. Politics can be a messy business. But in the past couple of years, since Trump was impeached twice and has been indicted in 4 entirely different events, from stealing state nuclear secrets to paying hush money to a porn star that he had an affair with, and so the right wing has incessantly talked about the Biden crime family, focusing primarily on Hunter Biden's laptop that somehow fell into the hands of a critic, that maybe this laptop will reveal criminal influence peddling, although in the last 2 years we don't appear to have gotten the laptop to show us that. But they hope to be able to tar President Biden with the same brush they're going to use on Hunter Biden. It still seems to be out of their reach, but they finally did get criminal charges against Hunter Biden. And that's what I really want to talk about today. It must be a very uncomfortable victory for Republicans who have, for a generation, insisted that absolutely anybody can buy any kind of gun that they want. But Hunter has been found guilty of lying on his background check before buying a handgun. Specifically, in filling out a form, one question asked if he was currently using illegal drugs. And he lied and said that he wasn't. America's gun laws are notoriously lax, but we at least make a show of asking relevant questions before selling anyone a gun. However, I will tell you, as someone who has done a lot of counseling work with alcoholics and addicts, expecting an addict to tell the truth on a form that asks them if they are an addict, that is the silliest thing I've ever heard of. Addicts are notorious liars, especially about their addiction. If the government were actually worried about selling guns to addicts, they would require a urine test or a blood test. But they don't do that because our gun laws are set up to allow, if not to encourage, virtually everyone to buy lots of guns. It'd be like asking Charles Manson in a gun shop, "Now, Mr. Manson, you don't plan on hurting anybody with this weapon, do you?" Manson's not going to say, "Darn, you caught me. Yeah, I was going to murder some people." I'm not saying that it isn't a crime, what Hunter Biden did, but drug users, alcoholics, people guilty of domestic violence, felons, child molesters, people whose judgment is impaired by the medications they take or by mental illness, they shouldn't be able to buy a gun. But we're really going to depend on self-reporting to find out if they've been beating their girlfriend or if they are addicted to heroin? What man guilty of domestic abuse is going to admit that they're guilty of domestic abuse at the gun counter at Walmart? Which one of the millions of Americans taking prescription Adderall will admit that they daily take a dose of the prescription form of methamphetamine every single day? They're not going to volunteer that information. If you add up all of the adults who have used meth, fentanyl, heroin, OxyContin, or cocaine, or who abuse alcohol in a country where there are more guns than there are people, then how many people are guilty of the same crime that we are threatening Hunter Biden with several years in prison for? But more importantly, prosecutors have persuaded legislatures to write drug laws so that prison sentences for drug possession or sale is dramatically increased if the offender owns a gun. An 80-year-old farmer from Bolivar, a little town just north of here, got arrested for growing marijuana a couple of years ago. And when he was arrested, they found a rusted out old shotgun in his trunk. How many 80-year-old farmers in Bolivar don't have a shotgun in the trunk of their car? But they sent this sick old man to jail for 10 years. I wrote to the judge and begged him for leniency. Isn't being a farmer in Bolivar punishment enough? And the judge told me that he just hated to do it. But there are mandatory sentences for having a gun while selling pot, which, by the way, is not true. Since when do we expect honesty out of the justice system, though? So he said that so that he didn't have to take responsibility for making the decision to imprison an old man who will certainly die in our state prisons. But here's the real kicker. How many other people have been charged with this particular crime who had not committed another crime? I get it. They're using the gun to increase the amount of time in jail. So if you are caught selling drugs or transporting drugs or something and you have a gun, it gets more serious. But how many other people have been convicted of lying on their forms and only buying a revolver because Hunter Biden didn't commit another crime? He didn't use the gun in a crime. And the truth is, I can't find any examples. And I have heard seasoned prosecutors admitting on TV that they don't know of any examples. This is a law intended to add time to the sentence of someone who uses guns in organized crime, not some spoiled rich kid of a famous politician who hangs out in dangerous places where he can buy drugs and a few minutes of heavy breathing with prostitutes. In spite of how much the First Family may love Hunter, there is no circumstance in which he is going to be nominated for Humanitarian of the Year. He is not a saint. He has some sad issues, but he has also been a very bad boy. But if it is fair to send Hunter Biden to jail for lying on a form about his drug use in order to buy a gun, are we going to go after everyone else who's done the same thing? How many people would you think, just statistically, might be guilty of that same crime right here in the little city where I live, of Springfield, Missouri? We're just one quick investigation away from being able to charge, heck, I don't know, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 20,000 people who have bought guns while using illegal drugs. I don't run in a rough crowd, but I know people who are regular drug users who have bought guns. And if they're listening right now, they are already in a cold, panicked sweat out of fear that I'm going to say their name before I finish this recording, which I'm not going to do. But it is something that you should think about before crowing about the arrest of Hunter Biden. Because if we arrested everyone who has committed the same crime, we'd have to start building prisons right now. We would need room for 10 or 20,000 new inmates right here in Springfield, Missouri. I don't know that I'm right about that. I'm just running the numbers on illegal drug use and the numbers of guns in the community. So I would love for you to prove me wrong. But if you're going to do that, you better pack a lunch and maybe dinner too, because the numbers seem pretty obvious. There are bigger questions surrounding Hunter Biden. Was he making a living off of his last name as a lobbyist, as so many children of famous politicians do? Or was he selling access to influence either his father or other politicians illegally? And is there any way that Joe Biden may have personally been involved? Those are legitimate concerns that deserve to be investigated, but really, do they deserve to be investigated quite as much as how Jared Kushner got $3 billion out of the Saudi royal family, or how Ivanka got all of those patents granted to her in China? Still, it's relevant. What Hunter did is relevant. But if you compare it, and not playing whataboutism in this case, because the comparison is huge, billions of dollars. And I'm not going to play dirty ball and ask the Justice Department to find out how many members of the Trump family are using illegal drugs while owning guns, because if I'm guessing, 50% might not cover the spread. But I don't know. And more importantly, I don't want to know, unless that gun was used in the commission of a serious crime. That's what makes it relevant. Here is what I do know. If you were not a narcissistic liar before you became a drug addict, the addiction will turn you into a narcissistic liar. If the government really wants to keep addicts from buying guns, then asking them for a confession on a form at the point of purchase is the dumbest possible thing that they could do. Ladies and gentlemen, I had to give a urine sample to be approved to be a hospice chaplain. It wouldn't be too much to ask someone to pass a pee test before being allowed to buy an assault rifle. Unless, of course, your re-election to office depends on the sales of assault rifles. And that, I submit, is the real issue here. The Trump cabal has been crying crocodile tears over how Democrats have weaponized the justice system and that there are Republicans who are being prosecuted for crimes that Democrats are never charged with. Turns out there weren't many Democrats storming the Capitol on January 6th. That, men and women, is just a lie. That 2.5 years have passed since January 6th insurrection and instigated by Donald Trump, and he still isn't in prison, is proof that there is a 2 or 3 or 4-tier justice system, and wealthy conservatives get out of prosecution so reliably that the Donald gets his feelings hurt if anyone actually does stand up for our Constitution and the rule of law and actually tries to hold him accountable for any of his crimes. We all know that justice should be blind, that the laws of our nation should apply to the rich and to the poor equally, that conservatives and liberals should be prosecuted for crimes in exactly the same way, just like blacks or whites. But we all know that we are very, very far from accomplishing that lofty goal. If Hunter Biden has committed serious crimes against this nation, he should be investigated and tried, and if found guilty, be given an appropriate sentence, just like everyone else. But he should not be sent to prison as a concession to conservatives, calling for a symbolic sacrifice of someone in the Biden family. And just as much energy needs to go into looking into the similar but much more egregious offenses of Eric, Don Jr., Ivanka, and Jared, as well as Don and his whole cadre of flying monkeys. Equal justice under the law, that's what I'm looking for. And right now it would be impossible for our government to even act like that's what the government is looking for. Kudos to Joe Biden for not using his considerable power to protect his troubled son in the way that Trump preemptively handed out pardons to many of his co-conspirators. I realize that this pulpit does not make me the judge of the world, but I know that I am not going to be inviting Hunter Biden to my Thanksgiving table this year. Still, I assure you, there is a whole laundry list of people ahead of him on the naughty list, and they have no business celebrating Hunter's woes. If Hunter's offenses are now the new watermark for who needs to go to jail for a decade, then I think we need to make certain that everyone below that watermark gets their own jail cell as well. That's just my opinion.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.